Ryan Mitchell's hand closed around the trigger guard of a rifle that could kill from nearly 4 kilometers away, and the first thing he did with that power was aim it at the very system that made him a hero. That single act of fury born from betrayal is where this story begins. If you're watching this, tell me the city you're watching from in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. And if stories about ordinary people who become extraordinary heroes move you, subscribe and stay with me until the very end. Nobody in that facility ever looked twice at Megan Walker. That was the truth of it, plain and simple. And for 10 years, she had made a kind of peace with it. She was 51 years old with steady hands and tired eyes, and she worked in a windowless room at the back of a U.S. Army precision weapons facility tucked into the folds of the Montana mountains, where the wind screamed against the metal roof in winter and the pine trees stood like silent witnesses in summer. Soldiers walked past her workshop every single day. Some of them nodded. Most of them didn't. None of them knew her name. She didn't mind, or she told herself she didn't. Megan had built a life out of precision, out of small, careful movements, the turn of a screw, the calibration of a scope, the delicate balance of tension in a firing pin. She believed with a conviction that ran bone deep that a weapon was only as trustworthy as the hands that built it, and that somewhere out there, a soldier's life depended on whether she had done her job right that morning. That was enough for her. It had to be enough. She never wanted the battlefield. She never wanted the medals, the parades, the folded flags. She wanted the quiet hum of her workshop, the smell of gun oil, the particular silence of a job done well. But silence, as Megan would soon learn, has a way of ending all at once. It was a Tuesday morning. She would remember that detail forever. The way people remember the weather on the day their whole life turned, when the door to her workshop opened without a knock and Major Ethan Brooks stepped inside like a storm that had decided to walk on 2 legs instead of blow through the valley. Megan looked up from the rifle bolt she was cleaning, startled. Officers didn't come to her workshop. Officers sent requisition forms. Officers sent junior soldiers with clipboards. They did not come themselves, and they certainly did not come with the look Major Brooks was wearing, a look Megan had only ever seen once before on the face of a man who had just watched something break that he thought could never break. Ms. Walker. His voice was tight, controlled in the particular way of a man forcing himself to stay calm. I need you to look at something. Of course, sir. Megan set down her tools, wiped her hands on the cloth at her belt. What is it? Major Brooks didn't answer right away. He walked to her workbench, instead set down a manila folder marked with a red classification stripe and opened it with the careful, deliberate motion of a man diffusing something dangerous. Inside were photographs, ballistic reports, a map with a single red line drawn across nearly 4 kilometers of open terrain. 3 days ago, Brooks said, one of our Overwatch teams recorded a confirmed kill at 3,800 meters. Megan blinked. For a moment, the number didn't register as anything more than digits on a page. And then it did, and something cold moved through her chest. That's not possible, she said quietly. Nobody makes that shot. Not with anything we manufacture. Not with anything anyone manufactures. That's what I said, Brooks replied. That's what everyone said, until we recovered the shell casing. He slid a photograph across the table. Megan didn't need to pick it up. She recognized it the instant her eyes fell on it. Recognized the tooling marks, the custom chambering, the particular signature of a barrel modification that existed in exactly one place in the entire world. Her own workshop. Her own hands. That's my work, she whispered, and her voice cracked on the last word because some part of her already understood what Major Brooks was about to say before he said it. I know, Brooks said, which is why I'm asking you, who did you build that rifle for? Megan's mind raced backward through 10 years of faces, 10 years of names signed on requisition forms, 10 years of soldiers who came to her with broken weapons and left with something better than new. And then without warning, one face rose up out of the crowd of memory, clear as if he were standing in the room with her. Ryan, she breathed. Sergeant Ryan Mitchell. Major Brooks' jaw tightened. You're certain. I modified that exact chambering for him 8 months ago. He said he wanted it for a training exercise. He said, Megan stopped. Her hand had begun to tremble just slightly against the edge of the workbench. He said he trusted me to do it right. That's what he told me. He said I was the only person on this base who ever treated the weapon like it mattered more than the mission. Ms. Walker, Brooks's voice dropped lower, and something in it made the hair on Megan's arms rise. Sergeant Mitchell has been listed as absent without leave for 6 weeks. Before that, he was under investigation for insubordination, for accessing classified mission files without authorization, and for threatening a superior officer. Megan felt the floor tilt beneath her. "That's not the man I knew," she said. "That's not Ryan wasn't like that." "People change, Ms. Walker." "No." Megan shook her head, and there was a fierceness in it that surprised even her. "People don't change like that. Something breaks them first." Brooks studied her for a long moment, and Megan watched something shift behind his eyes. Not disbelief exactly, but a kind of grim recalculation, as though he was seeing her for the first time not as a technician in a back room, but as someone who might actually understand the man they were hunting. "The man he killed," Brooks said slowly, "was Colonel Harold Reyes." Megan's breath caught. She knew that name. Everyone on the base knew that name. Colonel Reyes had been a rising star, a man with a chest full of commendations and a reputation for getting results. A reputation, Megan now realized with a sick, sinking feeling, that had always seemed to arrive a little too easily, a little too cleanly, as though the messy parts of his mission simply never made it into the official record. "Why would Ryan target him?" Megan asked, though even as the words left her mouth, some instinct deep inside her already suspected the shape of the answer, the way you sense a storm before the first raindrop falls. Major Brooks closed the folder. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its military edge entirely, and what remained underneath was something raw, something almost like grief. 11 months ago, he said, Sergeant Mitchell and his spotter were on a classified operation in a region I'm not authorized to name. They received intelligence approved and signed off by Colonel Reyes, that placed their extraction point in what should have been a secured corridor. "Should have been," Megan repeated. "It wasn't." Brooks's hands curled into fists at his sides, and he seemed to be fighting to keep his voice level. The corridor had been compromised 2 days earlier. That information existed. It was sitting in a briefing file that Reyes never bothered to update because updating it would have delayed a mission he wanted to close out before a review board looked at his numbers. Megan felt something twist in her stomach. "And Ryan's spotter." "Corporal Jason Miller," Brooks said, and the name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. 26 years old. He and Mitchell had served together for 4 years. Closer than brothers, from what I understand. Brooks's throat moved as he swallowed. Miller died in Mitchell's arms, bled out over 11 minutes while extraction was delayed because nobody could confirm the corridor was compromised because the man responsible for confirming it had already logged it as clear. The silence that followed felt enormous, filling every corner of the small workshop, until Megan could hear nothing but the low hum of the ventilation system and the hammering of her own heart. "Reyes was investigated," Brooks continued quieter now. "Cleared. The official finding blamed a communications failure, a technical glitch. Nobody's fault, tragic but unavoidable. Reyes kept his rank, kept his career. 6 months later, he made full colonel." Brooks's voice hardened into something bitter. "Miller's family got a folded flag and a pension that didn't cover his daughter's medical bills." Megan pressed a hand to her mouth. "Oh, God." "Mitchell tried to fight it," Brooks said. "Filed complaints, requested a formal review. Went to 2 different oversight boards. Every single one of them closed the case without reopening the investigation." He met Megan's eyes. And then 6 weeks ago, he stopped filing complaints. He stopped showing up to work. And 3 days ago, Colonel Harold Reyes was killed by a single round fired from 3,800 meters away, a shot so precise, so far beyond the accepted limits of what a rifle should be capable of, that half the analysts in my office still don't believe it happened. Megan stood very still, her mind spinning backward through months of memory, through every conversation she'd ever had with Ryan Mitchell in this very room, searching for the moment, the exact moment when the questions he'd asked her had stopped being curiosity and started being preparation. She remembered him leaning against her workbench, watching her hands as she worked. She remembered him asking about extreme long-range ballistics, wind drift calculations, at distances most snipers never attempted bullet drop compensation, the theoretical maximum range of a modified barrel under ideal conditions. She remembered thinking at the time that it was simply the curiosity of a serious professional, a man who wanted to understand his equipment down to its smallest tolerance. She had been wrong. She understood that now with a clarity that felt like ice water down her spine. He wasn't asking questions, Megan whispered. He was planning. Ms. Walker, Major Brooks's voice pulled her back into the room, sharp and urgent. I need to tell you something else, and I need you to stay calm when I do. Megan's stomach dropped. What? We intercepted communications 2 days ago, Brooks said. Fragments, not enough for a clear picture, but enough to know that Mitchell isn't finished. He paused, and Megan could see him weighing how much to say, weighing whether the woman standing in front of him could handle the weight of what came next. There's a name in those fragments, a second target. Who? Brooks looked at her steadily. You, Miss Walker. The words hit Megan like a physical blow. For a moment, she simply stood there, unable to process the sentence as though it had been spoken in a language she almost but didn't quite understand. Me, she finally managed. Why would Ryan want to hurt me? I built that rifle for him. I don't think he wants to hurt you, Brooks said carefully, but I think you're the only person who might be able to reach him before this goes any further. And that terrifies me almost as much as it might save lives, because it means I have to ask a woman who has spent 10 years in a back room to walk into the middle of an active manhunt for one of the most dangerous snipers this country has ever produced. Megan's mind was still catching up, still trying to hold the shape of everything Brooks had just told her, to the grief, the betrayal, the impossible shot, the target that might be her own name, when a new voice cut through the room, sharp with alarm. Major. A young communications officer burst through the door, so breathless, a tablet clutched in both hands. Sir, we just picked up a live transmission. Encrypted, but it bounced off the tower closest to the northern ridge. Voice match came back at 94%. Brooks turned so fast his boots scraped against the concrete floor. Mitchell. Yes, sir. The young officer's eyes flicked just for a second toward Megan, and something in that glance made her blood run cold. He asked for someone specific, by name. Who? Brooks demanded. The officer swallowed hard. Megan Walker. For a long moment, nobody in that workshop moved. The hum of the ventilation system seemed to grow louder, filling the silence like a held breath. Patch it through, Brooks said, finally, his voice low and hard. Now. The young officer set the tablet down on Megan's workbench with hands that weren't entirely steady, and a small speaker crackled to life. There was static first, and a lot of wind, the kind that only exists at high altitude, thin and cold and endless. And then underneath it, a voice Megan hadn't heard in 6 weeks. Megan. She flinched at the sound of her own name spoken in that familiar, ragged voice. It didn't sound like a killer's bawn. It sounded tired. It sounded like a man who hadn't slept properly in months. Ryan, she said, and her own voice surprised her by staying steady. It's me. I know it's you. A pause filled with wind. I asked for you. Brooks made a small motion with his hand. Keep him talking, and Megan understood without being told that every word she said from this point forward was being recorded, analyzed, triangulated. She pushed that thought aside. She had to. Ryan, where are you? She asked. Talk to me. What's going on? You already know what's going on, Ryan said. Brooks is standing right next to you, isn't he? I can hear it in the room. Too quiet. Too many people holding their breath. Megan glanced at Brooks. He gave a small, tight nod. Don't lie to him. He's here, she admitted. He told me about Reyes. There was a long silence on the line. When Ryan spoke again, his voice had changed, gone flatter, colder, like a door closing somewhere deep inside him. Did he tell you what Reyes did? Or just what Reyes was accused of, and then cleared of, and then promoted for? He told me about Jason, Megan said quietly. I'm sorry, Ryan. I'm so sorry. Something in the static shifted, a sharp exhale maybe, or a sound that might have been the beginning of something else entirely, something Ryan swallowed back down before it could fully form. Don't, he said, don't do that. Don't say his name like you knew him. I don't have to have known him to know what losing him did to you, Megan said. I built you that rifle, Ryan. I know your hands. I know how you hold a weapon when you trust it, and I know how you hold one when you're using it to hold yourself together. That second one, that's what I heard in your voice 8 months ago when you kept coming back to my workshop asking questions you didn't need answers to unless you were already planning something you couldn't say out loud. Brooks's eyes widened slightly. At that, a warning maybe, that she was pushing too hard too fast. But Megan kept going because some instinct told her this was the only chance she'd get. I should have asked you what was really going on, she said. I didn't. I let you leave my workshop 8 months ago, and I never once asked if you were okay because I told myself it wasn't my place, because I've spent 10 years telling myself that my only job was the metal in my hands, not the man carrying it. That was my mistake, Ryan. Not yours. Mine. The wind howled through the speaker for several long seconds. Nobody in the workshop breathed. You didn't do anything wrong, Ryan finally said, and his voice had softened just slightly. Just enough for Megan to hear the exhausted young man underneath the fury. You're the only person on that whole base who ever asked me a real question. Everybody else asked how the mission went. You asked how I was. Then let me ask you again, Megan said. How are you, Ryan, right now? Tell me the truth. Another silence, longer this time. I'm tired, Ryan said finally, and something in the admission seemed to cost him more than anything else he'd said. I'm so tired, Megan. I close my eyes, and I'm back there holding him, and I can still feel exactly how heavy he got in the last minute, right before he stopped himself. Megan heard him breathing hard on the other end of the line, fighting for control. I'm not finished, Ryan said abruptly, and his voice hardened again, snapping shut like a trap. Reyes was the first name on a list. He wasn't the only one who signed off on that mission. There's a general, I'm not going to say his name, over an open channel who buried the after-action report before it ever reached a review board. He's still active. He's still making decisions that get soldiers killed and calling it acceptable risk. Brooks stepped closer to the speaker, his voice sharp. Mitchell, this is Major Brooks. If you take another shot, you will be treated as an active threat, and I will have no choice but to authorize a response that ends this permanently. Do you understand me? I understand you perfectly, Major, Ryan said, and there was something almost calm in the way he said it. Calm in the terrifying mouth of a man who had already made peace with an ending. I understand that a system that let Reyes walk free for 11 months will move heaven and earth to stop me in 11 hours. Funny how that works. Ryan, Megan's voice cut through urgent now. Listen to me, please. Whatever you're planning, whoever's next on that list, it will not bring Jason back. You know that. You've had to know that every single night for 11 months. Then what am I supposed to do with this? Ryan's voice cracked for the first time, real emotion breaking through the flat control, and Megan felt her chest tighten at the sound of it. What am I supposed to do with all of it, Megan? The system doesn't listen to complaints. It doesn't listen to review boards. It only listens to consequences. I learned that from watching the system protect Reyes for 11 months while Jason's daughter waited for a father who was never coming home. So you're going to become the thing that killed him, Megan said quietly. You're going to become a weapon instead of a man, and you're going to tell yourself it's justice when really it's just grief that ran out of anywhere else to go. The line went silent. Megan could hear the wind, and beneath it, very faintly, she thought she could hear Ryan breathing ragged, uneven, a man standing at the edge of something and trying to decide whether to step back or step forward. I need to think, Ryan said finally, his voice barely above the static. I have to go. Ryan, wait. The line went dead, just static and then nothing at all. For a long moment, nobody in the workshop spoke. Brooks stared at the silent tablet as though it might come back to life if he watched it long enough. The young communications officer looked between Megan and the major, uncertain, waiting for orders. Give me a trace on that signal, Brooks finally said, his voice rough. I want a location within the hour. Yes, sir. The officer hurried out, already speaking into his own radio. Brooks turned to Megan, and for the first time since he'd walked into her workshop, she saw something other than authority in his expression. She saw something like respect mixed with something that looked almost like fear. You got further with him in 5 minutes than 3 negotiators got in 6 weeks, he said quietly. He doesn't need a negotiator. Megan said, her voice still unsteady from the conversation, from the sound of a man she'd once trusted, now standing at the edge of committing murder after murder in the name of a grief nobody had ever properly let him grieve. He needs someone to tell him the truth, and apparently that someone is me. Then I need you to come with us, Brooks said. Officially, unofficially, I don't care what paperwork it takes. If there's any chance you can reach him before this ends in a body bag, I need you out there. Megan looked down at her own hands, the same hands that had built the rifle, now aimed potentially at more names on a list only Ryan Mitchell knew. 10 years of careful, quiet work, and none of it had prepared her for this. None of it had prepared her for the weight of knowing that the precision she'd poured into that weapon might now determine whether more people lived or died, and whether the man who'd once trusted her with his equipment might trust her again with something far more fragile. "Okay," she said, and her voice, though it trembled, did not break. "I'll go." Brooks nodded, once sharp and decisive, already turning toward the door. "Briefing in 20 minutes, full team." He paused at the threshold, looking back at her. "Ms. Walker, Megan, for whatever it's worth, I don't think Reyes was the only one keeping secrets on this base, and I don't think this ends with Mitchell alone in those mountains." He left before she could ask what he meant, and Megan stood alone in her workshop for the first time all morning, surrounded by the rifles she'd spent 10 years perfecting, understanding with sudden and total clarity that the quiet life she had built for herself, screw by screw and scope by scope, was already gone. Whatever waited for her in those mountains, whatever truth Ryan Mitchell was chasing, whatever names remained on his list, whatever role she herself was about to play, in a story far bigger than a workshop nobody ever visited, there was no going back to the woman who repaired rifles and never stepped onto the battlefield. That woman had died the moment Major Brooks walked through her door. And somewhere out there on a ridge buried in Montana snow, a broken soldier sat beside the weapon she had built with her own two hands, staring down a decision that would determine not just his fate, but hers as well, and the fate of whoever's name came next. The trace came back in 43 minutes, not the hour Brooks had asked for, and the number on the screen made every soldier in the command room go quiet. "Signal bounced from a relay near Copper Ridge," the communications officer said, pointing at a topographical map spread across the table. "Elevation 9,000 feet, isolated. One access trail, and it's barely a trail, more like a goat path that freezes solid this time of year." Brooks leaned over the map, jaw tight. "That's not an accident. He picked that spot because it gives him line of sight on 3 different valleys and only one way in." Megan stood at the edge of the room, still wearing her work clothes, still smelling faintly of gun oil, feeling entirely out of place among the tactical vests and the rifles stacked against the wall. Nobody had told her yet exactly what her role would be. She only knew that Brooks had asked her to come, and that somewhere up on that frozen ridge, Ryan Mitchell was waiting for an answer she hadn't given him yet. "Sir," a younger officer, barely 30, stepped forward with a folder of his own. "Command wants a tactical resolution. They're not interested in a 6-hour standoff on a ridge with 3 lines of sight. They want a clean removal." Something cold moved through Megan's chest. "Clean removal, you mean they want to kill him?" The officer didn't quite meet her eyes. "I mean, command wants this resolved before Mitchell has a chance to take another shot at anyone else on that list." "He hasn't taken a shot at anyone since Reyes," Megan said, her voice rising before she could stop it. "He told me himself 30 minutes ago that he needed time to think. That's not the voice of a man who's already decided to keep killing." "With respect, ma'am, you're not trained to read operational intent." "No," Megan shot back, surprising herself with the steel in her own voice. "But I am trained to hear the difference between a man who's dangerous and a man who's drowning. And Ryan Mitchell is drowning." Brooks held up a hand before the younger officer could respond, silencing the room with the gesture alone. "Ms. Walker has a point that this team would do well to remember. Mitchell isn't erratic, he's precise. Everything he's done, the target selection, the distance, the timing, all of it has been deliberate. A man executing a plan doesn't sound like the man we heard on that call 30 minutes ago." "So what's your read, sir?" the younger officer asked. Brooks looked at Megan, and for a moment something passed between them. Not quite trust, not yet, but the beginning of it. "My read is that we have a very small window to reach him before grief finishes what betrayal started. And I think Ms. Walker just proved she's the only person capable of opening that window." The younger officer's expression didn't soften, but he said nothing further, and Brooks turned back to the map, tracing the single access trail with one finger. "Full team moves out in 90 minutes, Brooks said. "Cold weather gear, minimal footprint. I want 2 snipers on overwatch, positioned here and here." He tapped 2 ridge lines flanking Copper Ridge. "But nobody fires unless Mitchell fires first. Is that understood? Nobody fires first." A murmur of acknowledgement moved through the room. Megan felt her pulse hammering in her throat. "And Ms. Walker rides with me," Brooks added. "She's not tactical personnel. She stays behind the line until I say otherwise. But when the moment comes, and it will come, she talks to him. Nobody else. Megan nodded, though her mouth had gone dry, and her hands, steady for 10 years around delicate machinery, were trembling now in a way she couldn't quite control. 90 minutes later, she was sitting in the back of an armored transport vehicle, watching the pine forests of Montana blur past the window, climbing steadily toward elevation, toward cold, toward a ridge where a broken man sat with a rifle she had built, and a decision she prayed he hadn't already made. Brooks sat across from her, quiet for most of the ride, until finally he spoke, his voice pitched low enough that the driver up front couldn't hear. "Can I ask you something, Ms. Walker?" "Megan," she said, "if we're driving into a standoff together, you can call me Megan." A small, tired smile crossed his face, the first she'd seen from him. "Megan, can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why do you think he asked for you out of everyone on that base command, staff chaplains, people trained specifically for this, why you—" Megan considered the question for a long moment, watching the trees give way to steeper, rockier terrain outside the window. "Because I never asked him to be a hero," she said finally. "Everyone else on that base saw Ryan Mitchell as a weapon with a heartbeat, a tool that produced results. I saw a man who came into my workshop looking exhausted, and I asked him how he was doing instead of asking him how the mission went. That's it. That's the whole reason. I treated him like he mattered outside of what he could do with a rifle." Brooks was quiet for a moment. "That's a small thing to have built an entire rescue mission around." "Maybe," Megan said, "but grief doesn't care about small or large major. Grief attaches itself to whatever kindness it can find and holds on until it either heals or destroys everything around it. Ryan's grief found me. I don't know why, but it did, and now I have to be worth what he thinks I am, or a lot more people are going to get hurt." The vehicle jolted over a rut in the road, and Brooks braced himself against the wall, studying her with new eyes. "You know, when I walked into your workshop this morning, I expected to find a technician, a specialist, somebody who could tell me about barrel modifications and chambering tolerances. And instead, I think I found the only person in this entire operation who actually understands what we're dealing with." He looked out the window toward the mountains rising ahead of them, gray and merciless, under a sky heavy with the promise of snow. "I hope that's enough." "So do I," Megan said quietly, and neither of them spoke again for the rest of the drive. The staging area sat at the base of Copper Ridge, a flat clearing surrounded by dense pine, where soldiers moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this before, though Megan suspected none of them had ever done exactly this before, a manhunt for one of their own, a sniper whose skill they had trained and whose grief they had ignored until it turned lethal. Brooks huddled with his tactical team over a fresh set of maps while Megan stood at the edge of the clearing, arms wrapped around herself against the cold, watching her own breath fog in the thin mountain air. She had never been anywhere like this. 10 years in a windowless workshop had not prepared her for the particular silence of a wilderness that might at any moment erupt into gunfire. "Ms. Walker." She turned to find the young communications officer from earlier, approaching, tablet in hand, expression grim. "We re-established contact with Mitchell 8 minutes ago," he said. "He's requesting to speak with you again. Direct line. Major Brooks says it's your call whether you take it." Megan's heart lurched. "Put it through." The officer handed her a small radio unit, and a moment later the static crackled to life, followed by wind, and then that same tired, familiar voice. "Megan." "I'm here, Ryan." She stepped a few paces away from the staging area, needing suddenly for this conversation to feel private, even though she knew it wasn't. "Are you okay?" Define okay. A humorless laugh, dry as the wind around him. "I've been sitting up here for 6 weeks with nothing but Jason's voice in my head and a rifle you built with your own hands, and I still can't decide if that makes me the villain of this story or the only honest man left in it." "You're not the villain, Ryan, but you're not a hero either, not anymore, not the way you're going about this." "Careful," Ryan said, and something sharper crept back into his voice. "You're starting to sound like the review boards, not the way you're going about this. Tell me, Megan, what's the right way? Filing another complaint, waiting for another oversight, committee to close another case without reading it?" "No," Megan said firmly. "The right way isn't sitting on a ridge with a rifle pointed at people who might deserve consequences, but don't deserve execution. The right way is making sure what happened to Jason never happens to anyone else's Jason, And you can't do that from prison or from a body bag, which is exactly where this ends if you don't put that rifle down. Silence filled only with wind. You think I don't know that? Ryan's voice cracked just slightly. You think I haven't run every possible ending through my head 100 times over the last 6 weeks? I know how this ends, Megan. I've known since the moment I pulled that trigger on Reyes. I just needed somebody to finally hear me before it did. I'm hearing you, Megan said, her voice thick with emotion she hadn't expected to feel this strongly. I'm standing at the bottom of this mountain right now because I'm hearing you. So let me keep hearing you. Tell me about the general, the one you mentioned. Tell me what he did. There was a long pause, long enough that Megan wondered if the connection had dropped. His name is Whitfield. Ryan finally said, his voice dropping lower, as if even now, even here, some part of him understood the danger of saying it aloud. General Marcus Whitfield. He commanded the operation that got Jason killed. Reyes signed the intel report, but Whitfield is the one who buried the after-action review. I found the original draft, the real one, before it got sanitized. It named the compromise corridor. It named the exact hour the intelligence went stale. Whitfield had that report rewritten to protect Reyes because Reyes was Whitfield's protege, and Whitfield didn't want a scandal 3 months before his own promotion board. Megan felt sick. How do you know all this? Because I stole the original draft before they could destroy it, Ryan said. It's the reason I was investigated for accessing classified files. It's the reason they tried to discredit me before I could show it to anyone who mattered. It's the reason nobody believed me when I said Jason's death wasn't an accident, because the man who could confirm it had already spent months making sure I looked unstable, unreliable, dangerous. Megan's mind raced. This was bigger than a grieving sniper working through a private list of revenge. This was a cover-up reaching into the highest levels of command, and Ryan Mitchell, desperate, exhausted, betrayed by the very system he'd sworn to serve, had become both the only witness and the most convenient villain in a story someone else had written for him. Ryan, she said carefully, if you have that document, the real one, that's not something you avenge with a rifle. That's something you expose. That's something that could actually hold Whitfield accountable, publicly, permanently, in a way that no bullet ever could. You think anyone would believe a report handed over by a fugitive sniper wanted for murder? Ryan's voice was bitter now, edged with exhaustion. You think the same system that buried it once wouldn't bury it twice faster, cleaner, with my name attached to make it easier to dismiss? Then don't hand it over alone, Megan said, her voice rising with sudden urgency. Hand it over with me standing beside you. Hand it over through Major Brooks, who has spent the last 6 weeks trying to bring you in alive, instead of authorizing the kill order that command has been pushing for since this morning. A pause. Kill order. Megan hesitated, aware she'd just said something she probably wasn't supposed to reveal. But it was too late now, and some instinct told her the truth was the only currency that mattered anymore. There are people in that command structure who want this resolved quietly and permanently, she said. Brooks is fighting them. But that fight has a clock on it, Ryan. And every hour you stay up on that ridge with a rifle in your hands is another hour that clock runs closer to zero. If you want justice for Jason, real justice, the kind that actually changes something, you have to come down from there. You have to trust someone besides your own grief. The wind howled through the radio for a long, agonizing stretch of silence. I don't know how, Ryan finally said, and his voice had shrunk down to something small and young, and utterly unlike the precision instrument the Army had spent years training him to become. I don't know how to trust anyone anymore, Megan. Everyone I trusted either died or lied to me. Then trust the rifle, Megan said softly. Trust the hands that built it. I never lied to you, Ryan. Not once. And I'm not lying to you now when I say that coming down off that mountain is the only shot you have left at actually winning. Another silence. Megan closed her eyes, praying, though she wasn't a particularly religious woman, praying anyway to whatever might be listening on that frozen ridge. Give me an hour, Ryan finally said. 1 hour. I need to think, and I need you to promise me something. What? Promise me if I come down, you'll be the one standing there. Not Brooks, not his snipers. You. If I see a rifle pointed at me that isn't yours, I swear to God, Megan, I will not walk down off this mountain. Megan's throat tightened. I promise. The line went dead again, and Megan stood alone in the cold for a long moment, radio clutched in a trembling hand before turning back toward the staging area, where Brooks was watching her with an unreadable expression. You heard all of that, she said. It wasn't a question. Every word. Brooks's jaw was tight, his eyes hard with something that looked like fury, though Megan understood almost immediately it wasn't directed at her or even entirely at Ryan. Whitfield, he said almost to himself. God help me, I always wondered why that after-action report felt sanitized. You knew Whitfield. I served under him for 2 years, Brooks said grimly. I never trusted him, never could put my finger on why his claim until right now. He rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion suddenly visible in every line of it. If Mitchell really has the original draft of that report, this isn't just a manhunt anymore. This is a cover-up unraveling in real time, and I need to get ahead of it before command decides the easiest solution is putting a bullet in the only witness. Is that what they want? Megan asked, though some part of her already knew the answer. Brooks didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned toward his radio operator. Get me a secure line to General Reyna. Tell her I have information directly relevant to the death of Colonel Reyes that requires immediate escalation above this command's current authority. Sir, that's going over the current chain? I'm aware of exactly what it's going over, Brooks snapped. Do it, now. Megan watched him move with a new urgency, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun that morning, she felt something that wasn't quite hope, but was at least the shape hope might eventually take, the possibility that this story might not have to end with Ryan Mitchell's blood soaking into Montana snow. 40 minutes passed in a blur of tense preparation. Brooks paced the perimeter of the staging area, radio pressed to his ear, arguing in low, controlled tones with someone Megan assumed was several ranks above him. Soldiers checked and rechecked equipment. Somewhere on the ridge above them, Ryan Mitchell sat with his decision, and Megan found herself watching the tree line obsessively as if she might see him emerge at any moment. She didn't expect the interruption that came instead. Ma'am, a soldier approached her, young, nervous, glancing back toward Brooks before speaking. There's someone here asking for you, says she drove up from the base the moment she heard. Megan frowned. Who? The soldier stepped aside and a woman walked into the clearing, younger than Megan, maybe 30, with dark circles under her eyes and a little girl's photograph clutched so tightly in one hand that her knuckles had gone white. Are you Megan Walker? The woman asked, her voice trembling. Yes, Megan said carefully. Who are you, Sarah Miller? The woman's chin lifted, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Jason's wife. The clearing seemed to go very quiet around them. Megan felt her breath catch in her throat. I heard what's happening up there, Sarah continued, her voice cracking. I heard Ryan, and I heard he finally did something about Reyes, and I need you to understand something before whatever happens next happens. She held up the photograph, a little girl maybe 7 years old, missing her front teeth, grinning at the camera. This is my daughter, Emma. She was 2 when her father died. She doesn't remember him at all, not his voice, not his laugh, nothing. All she has is what people tell her, and half of what people told her for a year was that Jason died because of a communications error, some faceless glitch nobody could be blamed for. Sarah, Megan started, but the younger woman shook her head, cutting her off. The words pouring out now like something that had been dammed up for 11 months and had finally found a crack to escape through. I'm not here to stop Ryan, Sarah said, her voice fierce despite the tears now streaming freely down her face. God help me, some ugly part of me wanted Reyes dead the moment I found out what he did. But I'm here because Ryan is the only living person who was there when my husband died, and if he dies today on this mountain, I lose the only real answer I will ever have about what actually happened to Jason. I need him alive, Ms. Walker. Not for revenge, for the truth. Emma deserves to know the truth about her father someday, not the sanitized version some general wrote to protect his own career. Megan felt tears sting her own eyes, and beside her she was aware of Brooks approaching, having ended his call, listening to the last of what Sarah had said, with an expression of quiet, controlled devastation. Mrs. Miller, Brooks said gently, you shouldn't be here. This is an active operational area. I don't care, Sarah said, turning to face him with a fire that surprised even Megan. I have spent 11 months being told to be patient, to trust the process, to let the system work. The system got my husband killed and then lied about it. I am done being patient, Major. I want the truth, and I want Ryan Mitchell alive to give it to me. Brooks looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, and then he turned to Megan. When you talk to him again, he said quietly, I think there's someone else he needs to hear from. Megan looked at Sarah, who was already nodding, wiping tears from her face with the back of her hand, steadying herself with the visible effort of a woman who had learned over 11 brutal months how to hold herself together in front of the strangers. "I'll do it," Sarah said. "Whatever it takes. Please." The radio crackled in Megan's hand less than 10 minutes later. Ryan checking in early, his voice tighter now, more urgent, as though the hour he'd asked for had compressed itself under the weight of his own spiraling thoughts. "Megan, I've been thinking, and I don't think I can—" "Ryan, wait." Megan's heart pounded. "There's someone here who wants to talk to you, someone who drove 2 hours the moment she heard what was happening." Silence. "Who?" Megan held the radio out towards Sarah, whose hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped it before pressing it to her ear. "Ryan," she said, her voice breaking on the single syllable of his name. "It's Sarah." The silence that followed stretched so long, Megan feared the connection had failed entirely. When Ryan finally spoke, his voice had collapsed into something raw and unguarded, stripped of every wall he'd built over the last 6 weeks. "Sarah," a ragged breath. "God, Sarah, I'm so sorry. I should have called you months ago. I should have told you everything. I didn't know how to look you in the eye. Even over the phone, knowing I was the one who was supposed to bring him home. Ryan, stop." Sarah's voice was fierce through her tears. "You listen to me right now. I don't blame you. I have never once blamed you. Jason talked about you like a brother in every letter he sent me. He trusted you with his life, and you tried everything you could to save him. The only people I blame are the ones who lied about why he died and then let a good man's memory rot under a fake report while they got promoted. I have the real report," Ryan said, his voice thick. "The original, before Whitfield sanitized it. I've had it for months. I just didn't know what to do with it that would actually matter." "Then give it to me," Sarah said. "Give it to Major Brooks. Give it to a lawyer. Give it to a journalist. I don't care, but give it to someone who can actually use it to make sure Jason's death means something besides a folded flag and a lie. Please, Ryan. Emma needs her father's story told honestly someday. She doesn't need her father's best friend to die on a mountain trying to avenge something a courtroom could actually fix." The sound that came through the radio next was one Megan would remember for the rest of her life. A grown man, a trained sniper capable of killing from nearly 4 kilometers away, breaking down into quiet, devastated sobs on an open, frozen ridge, the sound carrying clearly through the static, raw, and unfiltered, and entirely human. "Okay," Ryan finally managed, his voice shredded. "Okay, I'll come down, but Megan—" "I'm here," Megan said, taking the radio back gently from Sarah's trembling hands. "You promised," Ryan said. "You promised it would be you standing there. Just you." Megan looked at Brooks, who nodded once, grim and resolute, already turning to relay new orders to his team: stand down the overwatch positions, hold every weapon, let her walk up alone. "I'll be there," Megan said into the radio, her own voice steady despite the fear coiling tight in her chest. "I'm coming up the trail right now. Just me. I promise." She handed the radio back to the young officer and turned to find Brooks already beside her, pressing a small comm unit into her palm. "Keep this on you," he said. "If anything goes wrong, it won't," Megan said, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it herself. "Megan?" Brooks's voice softened just slightly, the first name feeling foreign and important in his mouth. "You don't have to do this alone." "Yes," Megan said, looking up toward the ridge, where the pine trees gave way to bare granite and endless gray sky, where a broken man sat waiting with a weapon she had built and a truth that might finally set him free. "I think I do." She adjusted the strap of her jacket, took one last steadying breath of thin mountain air, and began walking toward the trailhead, toward Copper Ridge, toward whatever waited for her at the top of that frozen mountain. Not knowing as she took her first step onto that narrow, ice-slicked path that the hardest conversation of her entire life was still ahead of her, and that somewhere far below, back at the staging area, Major Brooks was already receiving a transmission that would change everything he thought he understood about who exactly wanted this operation to end in gunfire instead of surrender. The comm unit crackled against Brooks' hip before Megan had gone 20 yards up the trail. "Major, this is command. We need you back at the staging area immediately. Priority transmission, eyes only." Brooks hesitated, watching Megan's small figure already climbing steadily toward the tree line, growing smaller against the gray granite. Every instinct told him to stay, to keep watching over the operation he'd built, but the tone of that transmission carried a weight he couldn't ignore. "Copy," he said reluctantly, then turned to his second in command. Watch her. If anything changes, anything at all, you get me back here in 60 seconds. He jogged back toward the communications tent, and Megan, unaware of what was unfolding behind her, kept climbing. The trail was worse than she'd expected. Narrow ice slicked in patches, bordered on one side by a drop that made her stomach lurch every time she glanced down. She kept her eyes forward instead, focused on the rhythm of her own breathing, on the promise she'd made, on the sound of Ryan's voice breaking apart on that radio, like something finally mercifully cracking open after 11 months sealed shut. 20 minutes into the climb, her radio crackled. "Megan?" Ryan's voice closer now, though she still couldn't see him. "I can see you on the trail. Keep coming. Slow. There's ice past the second switchback." "I see it," she said, picking her way carefully around a sheet of frozen rock. "Ryan, are you alone up there?" "Just me and your rifle," he said, and there was something almost like dark humor in his voice. Now exhausted humor, the kind that comes after a person has cried until there's nothing left but a strange, hollow calm. "Funny, isn't it? You built the thing that might end up saving my life instead of the thing that ends it." "It was always going to be one or the other," Megan said, climbing higher, her breath fogging thick in the cold. "I just didn't know which one until today." She rounded the final switchback, and the ridge opened up in front of her, a wide, flat outcropping of granite, swept nearly clear of snow by the relentless wind, and there, seated with his back against a boulder, was Ryan Mitchell. He looked smaller than she remembered. That was the thought that struck her first, stronger than fear, stronger than caution. That the man she'd built a rifle for 8 months ago, the confident, capable sergeant who'd walked into her workshop with steady hands and a quiet certainty, had been replaced by someone hollowed out. Unshaven, his eyes rimmed red and sunken with exhaustion, a thermal blanket wrapped loosely around his shoulders against the mountain cold. The rifle lay across his knees, not raised, not aimed, just resting there the way a man might hold something he no longer knew what to do with. "Hi, Megan," Ryan said quietly. "Hi, Ryan." She stopped a careful distance away, close enough to talk, far enough to not seem like a threat. "You look tired." A broken laugh escaped him. Understatement of the century. He looked up at her, and something in his expression cracked further, the last of his composure sliding away. "I didn't think you'd actually come. I told you I would." "People tell me a lot of things," Ryan said. "Command told me they'd investigate Jason's death properly. The review board told me they'd take a second look. Everyone always tells me the thing I want to hear right up until it doesn't matter anymore." Megan lowered herself slowly onto a nearby rock, keeping her movements deliberate, unthreatening. "I'm not everyone, Ryan. I've never lied to you. Not about the rifle, not about anything." Ryan studied her for a long moment, and Megan watched something shift behind his exhausted eyes. Not quite trust, but the ghost of it flickering weakly back to life. "Sarah sounded," his voice caught. "She sounded like she meant it, about not blaming me." "She did mean it," Megan said gently. "She drove 2 hours the second she heard what was happening, Ryan. She's down there right now waiting because she needs you alive far more than she needs Whitfield or anyone else to suffer. Emma needs her father's story to mean something. Not another folded flag, not another lie." Ryan's hand moved almost involuntarily to rest against the stock of the rifle, and Megan felt her pulse spike, though she forced herself to stay perfectly still. "I keep thinking about the moment I pulled that trigger on Reyes," Ryan said quietly, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. "Everyone assumes it felt like justice. It didn't. It felt like falling. Like I'd been standing at the edge of something for 11 months, and the second I pulled that trigger, I just fell. And I haven't stopped falling since." "Then stop," Megan said softly. "Right now, put the rifle down, Ryan, and stop falling." "It's not that simple." "I know it's not," Megan said, "but it's simpler than what you're planning next. You told me there's a second name, Whitfield. If you go through with that, there's no falling anymore, Ryan. There's just gone. Forever. And Jason's story dies with you buried under whatever narrative the Army decides to write once you're not around to argue with it." Ryan flinched at that, visibly like she'd struck something raw and exposed. "I have the report," he said abruptly, reaching with trembling hands into the inside pocket of his jacket, pulling out a worn, folded set of papers protected inside a plastic sleeve. "The original after-action review, before Whitfield's people rewrote it. It names the compromise corridor. It names the exact time the intelligence went stale. It proves Reyes knew and it proves Whitfield knew Reyes knew and buried it anyway. He held it out toward her, hand shaking, and Megan rose slowly, crossing the short distance between them, taking the papers with careful, steady hands, the same hands that had built the rifle, now resting forgotten against his knee. "This is everything," she breathed, scanning the first page, seeing dates, timestamps, a corridor, status marked compromised in red ink, and beneath it a second version of the same page with that same status quietly erased. "That's everything," Ryan confirmed, his voice hollow. "That's 11 months of my life, Megan. That's the only thing I have to show for it besides a body count and a career I'll never get back." "Then let it be enough," Megan said, urgent, now gripping the papers tightly against her chest. "Let this be the weapon instead, Ryan, not the rifle. This, give me this, and let Brooks take it straight to whoever's above Whitfield's reach, and let the world see exactly what happened to Jason without you having to pull another trigger to make them listen." Ryan stared at her for a long, agonized moment, and Megan watched the war happening behind his eyes. 11 months of grief and fury pulling one direction, exhaustion, and the fragile ghost of hope pulling the other. "And if it doesn't work?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "If they bury it again? If Whitfield walks free the same way Reyes almost did? Then we fight it a different way," Megan said. "A way that doesn't end with you in a body bag or a prison cell for the rest of your life. A way Jason's daughter can actually be proud of someday, instead of having to explain why her father's best friend became a murderer trying to avenge him." The word landed hard. Ryan flinched again, and for a moment Megan feared she'd pushed too far, said the one thing that might snap whatever fragile thread still held him to this decision. But then his shoulders sagged, the fight visibly draining out of him, and his hand slid away from the rifle entirely. "Okay," he said, voice cracking. "Okay, Megan, I'll—" The crack of a gunshot split the mountain air. Megan screamed as Ryan's body jerked violently sideways, blood blooming instantly across his shoulder, the rifle clattering uselessly off the rock as he collapsed backward against the boulder. "Ryan!" Megan dropped to her knees beside him, hands pressing instinctively against the wound, blood hot and slick between her fingers. "Ryan, stay with me, stay with me." "Sniper," a voice crackled through her comm unit, frantic distant. "We have an unauthorized shooter on the eastern ridge. That's not one of ours. Repeat, that is not one of our positions." Megan's mind reeled, horror and confusion colliding as she pressed both hands hard against Ryan's shoulder, feeling his blood soak warm through her fingers despite the freezing air. "Who fired Brooks? Said nobody fires unless he does first. He never raised that rifle. He was surrendering. He was—" "Megan." Ryan's voice was weak, thready, his face already draining pale. "Megan, listen to me." "Don't talk," she begged, pressing hard at tears freezing against her cheeks. "Save your strength. Help is coming. Just hold it in." "The shot," Ryan gasped, his hand weakly gripping her wrist. "That wasn't Brooks's team. That trajectory that came from higher up the ridge. Somebody's been up here longer than me." Megan's blood ran cold as the implication settled over her. Someone else had been watching this entire exchange from a position even Ryan hadn't known about, someone who had waited patiently, silently, until the exact moment Ryan agreed to surrender. Until the exact moment the evidence changed hands and then pulled a trigger, meant to make sure that evidence and the man carrying it never made it off this mountain. "Whitfield," Megan breathed, understanding crashing over her like ice water. "He has someone up here. He's been listening this whole time." Her comm unit erupted with chaotic chatter, Brooks's voice cutting through sharp with fury and fear. "Megan, report. What's your status? Is Mitchell down?" "He's hit!" Megan shouted back, still pressing frantically against the wound, blood now soaking through her jacket sleeves. "Shoulder, he's bleeding badly. I need medevac now. And Brooks, it wasn't your team. Someone else is up here. Someone was waiting for him to surrender before they—" "Copy. We're moving. Hold your position. Help is 6 minutes out." Ryan's grip on her wrist tightened, weak but insistent, and Megan looked down to find his eyes locked on hers, glassy with pain but fiercely, desperately clear. "The report," he gasped. "You have to get it to Brooks. Now. Before whoever's up here finishes what they started." Megan looked down at the papers still clutched against her chest, blood smearing across the plastic sleeve, and understood with sudden, sickening clarity that she was now the only person on this mountain who possessed proof of a cover-up someone was clearly willing to kill to protect. "I'm not leaving you," she said fiercely. "You have to. Ryan's voice was fading, his skin ashen, but his eyes held hers with a desperate intensity. If they get that report, Jason's death disappears again forever. Please, Megan, you promised me the truth would matter. Make it matter. Megan's mind raced, torn between the blood soaking her hands and the papers pressed against her chest, between the man dying in front of her and the truth he'd bled to protect. She grabbed the small first aid kit clipped to her belt, standard issue, given to her before she'd started up the trail, and with trembling, blood-slicked hands, she packed the wound as tightly as she could, pressing Ryan's own hand against the compress. Hold this. Hold it as tight as you can. I'm not going far, I promise you that, but I have to move now before whoever's up here decides to finish the job. She rose on unsteady legs, scanning the ridge above them, searching for any sign of movement among the rocks and scattered snow, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Brooks, she said into her calm voice, shaking but determined, I have the original after-action report. Ryan gave it to me before he was hit. I need you to get a team up here immediately, and I need someone to secure this document before The second shot came without warning, striking the rock inches from her feet, sending fragments of stone stinging across her cheek. Megan dropped instinctively, shielding the papers with her own body, pressing herself flat against the granite beside Ryan. Megan! Brooks's voice roared through the comm, frantic now. Megan, report your status. I'm okay, she gasped, though her voice betrayed how far from okay she actually was. They're still shooting, Brooks. They're trying to stop me from bringing this down the mountain. Hold position. Do not move. I have a team ascending the northern approach right now. 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Megan looked at Ryan, whose eyes were fluttering now, his breathing shallow and uneven, blood still seeping despite the compress pressed against his shoulder. 3 minutes felt like an eternity when a man was dying in front of her, and an unseen shooter somewhere on that ridge clearly intended to make sure neither of them left this mountain alive. Ryan, she said urgently, shaking him gently. Ryan, stay with me. Look at me. His eyes opened, unfocused, struggling to find her face. Megan, I need you to tell me something, she said, thinking fast, desperate to keep him conscious, keep him talking, keep him anchored to this world instead of slipping away from it. The shooter. Do you have any idea who Whitfield would send? Someone who knows this terrain? Someone capable of a shot like that? Ryan's brow furrowed weakly, fighting through the pain and the encroaching darkness at the edges of his vision. There's a specialist attached to Whitfield's personal security detail. Former sniper instructor. Names. His voice trailed, strength failing. Ryan, stay with me. The name Voss, he managed, barely audible. Master Sergeant Daniel Voss. The name meant nothing to Megan, but she committed it to memory, instantly repeating it into her comm unit, even as a third shot cracked against the rocks above them, closer this time, forcing her to flatten herself even further against the frozen granite. Brooks, did you copy that? Voss, Master Sergeant Daniel Voss. He's the shooter. He's attached to Whitfield's security detail. There was a long, staticky pause, and when Brooks's voice returned, it carried a note of grim, furious clarity. Copy. That confirms it. Megan listened to me very carefully. Command just intercepted a transmission from Whitfield's office 15 minutes ago, authorizing what they called a contingency resolution on Copper Ridge. I think Whitfield found out Mitchell had that report before we did, and he sent Voss up there to make sure it never left that mountain. Megan's blood turned to ice. This wasn't a rogue soldier acting alone anymore. This was a general orchestrating a second death on top of the one he'd already covered up to protect a career built on somebody else's daughter growing up without a father. How far out is your team? She demanded. 90 seconds, Brooks said. Hold on, Megan. Just 90 more seconds. 90 seconds had never felt so impossibly long. Megan pressed herself tighter against the rock, one hand still holding the papers close against her body, the other resting on Ryan's chest, feeling the faint, unsteady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palm, willing it to keep going, willing him to survive long enough for the truth he'd bled for to actually matter. A fourth shot rang out, and this time Megan heard something different in it. Not the sharp crack of a round striking rock, but a heavier, more distant boom, followed almost instantly by a shout from somewhere above them. Contact eliminated. Shooter is down. Repeat. Shooter is down. Megan's breath left her in a rush of relief, so overwhelming her vision blurred with sudden tears. Boots pounded against rock, and moments later Brooks himself came into view, cresting the ridge with his tactical team, close behind a medic already sprinting toward Ryan's slumped form. Megan. Brooks dropped to his knees beside her, his face etched with a fear she hadn't expected from a man who'd spent his entire career maintaining rigid composure. Are you hit? Talk to me. I'm fine, she managed, though her hands were shaking violently now that the immediate danger had passed. Ryan, he needs help. He's lost so much blood. We've got him. Brooks's voice was steady again, commanding as the medic began working with rapid, practiced efficiency, calling out vitals, applying pressure, preparing him for the evacuation that was already thundering toward them in the form of a helicopter cresting the ridge from the south. You did it, Megan. You got him talking. You got the report. Megan looked down at the blood-smeared papers still clutched against her chest. Papers that had nearly cost both her and Ryan their lives, papers that represented the only surviving proof of exactly how far a general was willing to go to protect a lie 11 months old. It's not over, she said, her voice hardening even through her exhaustion. Whitfield sent that shooter Brooks. He knew about this report before we did. That means he's not going to stop just because his hired gun failed. If anything, this makes him more dangerous, not less a man that, desperate to protect himself, isn't going to just walk away. Brooks's expression darkened, and he rose to his feet, watching as the medic and two soldiers carefully lifted Ryan onto a stretcher, moving him toward the waiting helicopter, with the urgent efficiency of people racing against a clock that had already run dangerously thin. You're right, Brooks said grimly, which means we're not just protecting Mitchell anymore. We're protecting the truth itself, and General Marcus Whitfield just declared in the clearest possible terms exactly how far he's willing to go to make sure it never sees daylight. He turned to Megan, extending a hand to help her rise on legs still trembling from adrenaline and cold in the sheer bone-deep terror of the last 10 minutes. Come on, he said. We need to get you off this mountain, get that report somewhere safe, and figure out exactly how deep this goes, because if Whitfield was willing to order a kill shot on an active operational ridge just to bury 11-month-old evidence, I don't think for 1 second he's finished trying. Megan took his hand, rising unsteadily, her eyes drifting one last time toward the stretcher, disappearing into the helicopter toward the man who had spent 11 months carrying grief so heavy it had nearly turned him into someone unrecognizable, who had in the end chosen to trust her instead of finishing what Fury had started. Whatever came next, whatever fight still waited for them, once they carried that blood-stained report down off Coppermore Ridge and into the daylight, Megan understood with a clarity that settled deep into her bones that there was no version of this story anymore, where she quietly returned to her workshop and disappeared back into the safety of anonymity. The mountain had changed her as surely as it had nearly killed Ryan Mitchell. And somewhere below, in offices and command centers far from this frozen ridge, General Marcus Whitfield was about to discover that the woman he'd tried to silence had survived, and that she was carrying against her own chest, wrapped in Ryan's blood, the exact proof that would end him. The hospital corridor smelled like antiseptic and cold coffee, and Megan had been sitting in the same plastic chair for 6 hours, still wearing the same blood-stained jacket, refusing every offer to change into something clean, because some stubborn part of her needed to keep Ryan's blood on her sleeves until she knew for certain that he was going to survive. Ms. Walker. She looked up to find a surgeon in scrubs approaching, mask pulled down around his neck, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. He's stable, the surgeon said, and Megan felt the breath she'd been holding for 6 hours finally leave her body in a rush. The round missed the subclavian artery by less than a centimeter. If that compress hadn't gone on when it did, he wouldn't have made it off that mountain. Can I see him? He's sedated, probably won't wake for a few hours. The surgeon hesitated, studying her with something like curiosity. For what it's worth, the trauma team said the field dressing was some of the best improvised pressure work they'd seen. Whoever taught you first aid did a hell of a job. Megan managed a tired, watery smile. 10 years around precision equipment. You learn to keep your hands steady when it matters. The surgeon nodded and disappeared back down the corridor, and Megan sank back into the plastic chair, only now allowing herself to feel the full weight of exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders. Megan. She looked up to find Brooks approaching, still in his tactical gear, a folder clutched under one arm, his expression grim in a way that told her the fight was far from over. He's stable, she said before Brooks could ask. The surgeon says he's going to make it. Something in Brooks's shoulders eased just slightly. Good, that's good. He sat down in the chair beside her, setting the folder on his lap, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, both simply absorbing the strange, fragile relief of having survived something neither of them had fully processed yet. I took the report to General Reyna personally, Brooks finally said. 2 hours ago, secure facility, no digital transmission, hand delivered. Megan straightened, and she read it in front of me, every page. Brooks's jaw tightened. Meg and I have served under a lot of officers in my career. I have never seen someone go that pale reading a document. Does she believe it's authentic? She's already ordered a full forensic review of the original mission files cross-referenced against Whitfield's sanitized version. If even half of what's in that report checks out, this isn't just going to end Whitfield's career. This is going to trigger a congressional inquiry into how many other after-action reports have quietly disappeared under his command over the last decade. Megan felt something loosen in her chest, not quite triumph, not yet, but the first real hint that Ryan's 11 months of grief and fury might actually translate into something that mattered. But, Brooks continued and the word landed heavy, Whitfield isn't just going to sit back and let this happen. Voss is dead. That's one loose end tied off. But Voss wasn't operating alone. Someone had to authorize that shot. Someone had to know exactly where Mitchell was hiding, which means somebody inside our own command structure fed Whitfield real-time intelligence on an active Army manhunt. Megan's stomach dropped. You think there's someone else? Someone still active? I think, Brooks said carefully, that whoever leaked Mitchell's position to Whitfield is probably watching very closely right now to see whether that report actually made it into the right hands. And I think that person is not going to be pleased to learn it did. As if summoned by the thought itself, Brooks's phone buzzed sharply in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and his expression shifted instantly from grim resolve to something sharper, more alarmed. It's Reyna, he said, answering immediately. General, go ahead. Megan watched his face as he listened, watched the color drain slowly from his cheeks, watched his free hand curl into a fist against his knee. When, he finally said, how long ago? A pause. Copy, I'm moving now. He ended the call and turned to Megan, his expression tight with barely controlled urgency. The original files, he said, the ones I hand-delivered 2 hours ago, they were being transported under armed escort to a secure records facility for the forensic review. He paused and Megan felt dread pooling cold in her stomach, even before he finished the sentence. The transport vehicle never arrived. What does that mean? It means somebody intercepted a secure military transport carrying the only forensic-grade copy of that report, Brooks said grimly, already rising to his feet. And it means whoever's protecting Whitfield just escalated from covering up an 11-month-old cover-up to committing an act that's going to be very, very hard to explain away as an accident. Megan rose with him, her exhaustion forgotten, replaced by a fresh surge of adrenaline. The report I carried down the mountain is that the only copy. Brooks hesitated, and something in his hesitation made Megan's blood run cold. I made one photocopy before I handed the original to Reyna, he admitted. Standard protocol. It's in a secure evidence locker back at the base. Then that's the only surviving copy now. Yes, Brooks said grimly, which means we need to move it immediately before whoever intercepted that transport realizes a backup exists and comes looking for it too. They left the hospital within minutes, Brooks driving with a controlled intensity that betrayed just how seriously he was taking the threat. Megan clutching her seatbelt with white knuckles as the base's perimeter lights came into view through the windshield. Talk to me about who else knew, Megan said, trying to organize the chaos spinning through her mind. Who else knew that photocopy existed? Myself, General Reyna, the evidence custodian who logged it into the locker. Brooks's hands tightened on the wheel. That's it. 3 people. Then it's one of those 3, Megan said quietly, or someone close enough to one of those 3 to have overheard something they shouldn't have. Brooks said nothing, but the tightness in his jaw told Megan he was already running through the same terrible calculation she was, that somewhere inside a chain of command, built on trust and rank, and decades of institutional loyalty, someone had chosen Whitfield's protection over the truth, and that person was still out there, still capable of doing significant damage. They reached the base 20 minutes later, and Brooks moved through the security checkpoints with an urgency that drew concerned looks from every soldier they passed, leading Megan through a maze of hallways toward a records building tucked behind the main administrative complex. The evidence locker room was empty when they arrived. No custodian at the desk, no soldier standing guard, just an unsettling silence that made the hair on the back of Megan's neck rise. "That's wrong," Brooks said, immediately unholstering his sidearm in one smooth practice motion. "This room is never left unattended. Ever." He moved forward cautiously, and Megan followed close behind, her heart hammering against her ribs as they rounded the corner toward the secured evidence cabinets. The custodian was slumped in his chair unconscious, but breathing, a dark bruise already forming along his temple. "Call medical," Brooks snapped, already moving past him toward the cabinet marked with the evidence tag Megan recognized from the folder he'd shown her, the same case number, the same classification. The cabinet door hung open. Empty. "It's gone," Brooks said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "The photocopy is gone." Megan felt the floor tilt beneath her, the same sensation she'd felt that morning in her workshop when Brooks had first shown her the ballistic report, the same sickening realization that the ground she thought she was standing on had just shifted violently beneath her feet. "Both copies," she said numbly, "the original and the photocopy, both gone in the same afternoon. Somebody's cleaning house," Brooks said grimly, already reaching for his radio. "And they're doing it fast, which means they're scared. Which means Whitfield knows exactly how close this came to ending him." Behind them, the custodian stirred, groaning, and Megan rushed to his side as his eyes fluttered open, disoriented and afraid. "Sir, can you hear me?" Megan asked gently. "Do you know who did this?" The custodian's eyes struggled to focus, his hand rising weakly to touch the bruise on his temple. "Didn't see a face," he mumbled. "Came in fast. Flash credentials said it was a priority transfer order. I turned to verify the paperwork, and that's the last thing I remember." "Priority transfer order," Brooks repeated, his expression darkening further. "Somebody with enough authority to walk in here and claim that without raising suspicion. That's not some low-level operative, Megan. That's somebody with real rank, real clearance." Megan's mind raced backward, trying to piece together everything that had happened since that morning. The leak that led Voss to Copper Ridge, the intercepted transport, now this. A pattern was emerging, and it terrified her. "Brooks," she said slowly, "what if it's not just one person? What if Whitfield built more than just a cover-up 11 months ago? What if he built a network, people embedded at every level, ready to protect him the moment anything threatened to expose what really happened to Jason?" Brooks's expression turned grim, and for a moment he said nothing, simply staring at the empty evidence cabinet as the full scope of what they were facing settled over him. "If that's true," he finally said, "then we don't just need to expose Whitfield. We need to figure out how deep this goes, and we need to do it before whoever's protecting him decides that the two of us know entirely too much to be allowed to keep talking." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication, and Megan felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the cold evidence room around them. "There's one more copy," she said, suddenly remembering something that sent a jolt of desperate hope through her exhausted mind. "Ryan mentioned it up on the ridge before he was hit. He said he found the original draft months ago, but he also said he'd made digital scans just in case something happened to the physical document. He said he hid them somewhere only he would know how to find." Brooks's eyes sharpened with sudden, urgent focus. "Did he tell you where?" "No," Megan admitted, "but he's stable now. He's going to wake up eventually. And when he does, he might be the only person left who can tell us where to find proof that can't be stolen out of an evidence locker or intercepted off a secure transport route." Brooks was already moving, radio pressed to his ear, calling for additional security to be posted at the hospital. His voice tight with an urgency that told Megan he understood with painful clarity exactly how much now rested on a wounded man's ability to survive long enough to wake up and remember where he had hidden the truth. They drove back to the hospital in tense silence, Megan watching the darkened Montana landscape blur past the window, her mind replaying every detail of the last 12 hours, searching for anything they might have missed and any thread that might lead them to whoever inside their own ranks had chosen loyalty to a general over loyalty to the truth. When they arrived, 2 additional soldiers stood guard outside Ryan's hospital room, and Megan felt a small measure of relief at the sight of them, though it did little to ease the anxious knot lodged permanently in her chest. "Any change?" Brooks asked the nurse stationed nearby. "He's been in and out," the nurse said. "Still groggy from the sedation, but his vitals are strong. He might be more lucid soon." Megan pushed through the door quietly, finding Ryan propped against a pillow, pale but breathing steadily, his eyes fluttering open as she approached. "Megan," he murmured, his voice hoarse and thin, "I'm here," she said, taking the seat beside his bed, reaching for his hand without thinking, needing the physical reassurance that he was in fact still alive. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got shot," Ryan said, and the ghost of dark humor in his voice brought an unexpected wave of relief through Megan's chest. "Did it work? The report, did it get to the right people?" Megan hesitated, and something in her hesitation must have registered on her face because Ryan's expression shifted immediately, alertness cutting through the fog of sedation. "What happened?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Both copies are gone," Megan said quietly. "The original I carried off the mountain and the photocopy Brooks kept in the evidence locker. Someone inside the chain of command took them both within hours of each other." Ryan's jaw tightened, and despite his weakened state, Megan watched something harden behind his eyes. Not the fury that had driven him onto that ridge, but something steadier, more determined. "The digital scans," he said. "I need you to find my old apartment. There's a loose floorboard under the closet third panel from the wall. There's a drive hidden underneath wrapped in a plastic bag. High-resolution scans of every page, timestamp metadata intact. Untouchable." Megan felt a surge of hope rush through her exhausted body. "You're sure it's still there?" "I hid it the night I found the report," Ryan said. "Nobody knows about it, not even the people who tried to discredit me before all this started. It's the only copy I never told anyone about because some part of me always knew this might happen." Brooks, who had entered quietly behind Megan, stepped forward with renewed urgency. "Give me the address. I'll send a secure team immediately." "No," Ryan said firmly, struggling weakly to sit up straighter despite the IV lines tugging at his arm. "Not a team. Whoever's doing this has eyes inside our own operation. A team moving on my apartment is a signal, and if there's a leak, that signal gets back to Whitfield before you're even through the front door." "Then who?" Brooks asked. Ryan's eyes moved to Megan, steady despite his exhaustion, filled with the trust that made her chest tighten with the weight of it. "Her," he said. "Nobody's watching Megan. Nobody thinks a weapons technician from a backroom workshop matters enough to track. That's exactly why it has to be her." Megan felt the familiar cold spike of fear move through her chest, but beneath it, something steadier. A resolve that had been building all day ever since Major Brooks had first walked into her quiet workshop and shattered the careful, anonymous life she'd built for herself. "Give me the address," she said. Ryan recited it slowly and Brooks wrote it down, though his expression remained deeply uneasy about sending Megan out alone into what might already be a very dangerous situation. "I don't like this," Brooks admitted. "If they're watching Ryan's known associates, they're watching for soldiers," Megan interrupted. "For tactical teams, for anyone who looks like a threat. Nobody's watching for a 51-year-old rifle technician driving a beat-up sedan. That's the entire point, Brooks. I've been invisible for 10 years. Let's use that." Brooks studied her for a long moment, something like reluctant admiration crossing his tired features before finally nodding. "Take my sidearm," he said, unholstering it and pressing it into her hands despite her visible hesitation. "I hope to God you never need it. But if this is really as deep as I think it is, I'm not sending you out there unarmed." Megan looked down at the weapon in her hands, heavier, colder, more final than any rifle bolt she'd ever calibrated in the quiet safety of her workshop, and felt the full staggering weight of exactly how far this day had carried her from the woman who repaired weapons but never stepped onto the battlefield. "I'll be careful," she said, tucking the weapon away, and turned toward the door toward a darkened apartment somewhere across the city, toward the last surviving piece of proof that could finally bring General Marcus Whitfield's carefully constructed lies crashing down around him, unaware that even now someone inside the very command structure sworn to protect this investigation was already watching, waiting, calculating exactly how much further they were willing to go to make sure the truth stayed buried forever. Megan drove through the darkened streets with Brooks's sidearm pressing cold and unfamiliar against her hip, her hands steady on the wheel despite the storm of adrenaline still coursing through her body. The city outside looked ordinary. Porch lights glowing, a dog barking somewhere behind a fence, a couple walking hand in hand past a closed diner, and the sheer normalcy of it all felt almost obscene against the weight of what she was carrying. Ryan's apartment complex sat on the quiet edge of town, a modest two-story building with peeling paint and a stairwell light that flickered erratically. Megan parked 2 blocks away just as Brooks had instructed and walked the rest of the way on foot, scanning every parked car, every shadowed doorway, every possible vantage point a watcher might use. Nothing. No movement, no sign she was being followed. She let herself in with the spare key Ryan had described hidden beneath a loose brick by the door frame, and the apartment swallowed her in silence the moment the door clicked shut behind her. Dust in the air, curtains drawn, the stale stillness of a place that hadn't been lived in for 6 weeks. She moved straight to the closet, dropped to her knees, and counted panels from the wall, exactly as Ryan had told her. Third panel. Her fingers found the seam, pried gently, and the floorboard lifted with a soft groan to reveal a small, plastic-wrapped bundle tucked into the dark space beneath. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped it, a small external drive exactly as promised, cool and solid against her palm. She had barely tucked it into her jacket when she heard it. A floorboard creaking in the hallway outside the apartment. Not the wind, not her imagination. Someone was here. Megan's heart slammed against her ribs. She reached for the sidearm at her hip, fingers fumbling with unfamiliar urgency, and pressed herself flat against the wall beside the closet, breath held listening. The front door handle turned slowly, deliberately. She had seconds, not minutes, in every instinct she'd built over 10 years of careful, controlled precision, screamed at her to think, not panic, to use the one advantage she actually had. She was small. She was quiet. And whoever was coming through that door expected an empty apartment, not a woman waiting in the dark with a weapon she barely knew how to use. The door swung open. A flashlight beam swept across the room. Megan didn't move, didn't breathe, watching from the shadow of the closet doorway as a figure stepped inside, tall-dressed in plain civilian clothes, moving with the deliberate, practiced caution of someone trained for exactly this kind of work. The figure moved toward the closet. Megan's finger found the trigger guard, just as Brooks had shown her in 30 frantic seconds back at the hospital, and she stepped out from the shadow weapon. Ray's voice shaking but firm. "Don't move." The figure froze. The flashlight beam swung toward her face, blinding her for an instant, and a voice, female, startled, cut through the darkness. "Ms. Walker." Megan's breath caught. She knew that voice. Sarah. The flashlight lowered, and Sarah Miller stood there, pale and breathless, her own hands raised slightly in surprise. "Oh my God, Megan, it's me. It's just me." "What are you doing here?" Megan demanded, lowering the weapon with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "You scared me half to death." "I could say the same," Sarah said, exhaling shakily. "I came because Ryan called me from the hospital 20 minutes ago. He said there might be a second hiding place. He forgot to mention something he had hidden here before he even started modifying that rifle. Something related to Jason's personal effects that never got returned to me. I didn't know you'd be here. Nobody told me." Megan's mind raced, piecing together the coincidence, the timing. The fact that two people converging on the same apartment within minutes of each other suddenly felt far less like coincidence and far more like something had gone wrong with communication somewhere along the chain. "Sarah, did anyone follow you here?" "I don't think so," Sarah said, though uncertainty flickered across her face. "I drove straight from the base." "Why?" Before Megan could answer her, radio crackled sharply against her hip. "Megan," Brooks's voice tight with urgency. "Status report now." "I have the drive," Megan said quickly, "and Sarah Miller is here too. Ryan sent her, said there was something else hidden in the apartment." There was a pause, and when Brooks spoke again, his voice had gone sharp with alarm. "Megan, I never authorized anyone else to move on that location, and Ryan hasn't made any outgoing calls in the last hour. He's been under continuous medical observation since you left." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Megan's feet for the second time that day. She turned slowly towards Sarah, whose face had gone very still, very careful in a way that hadn't been there a moment ago. "Sarah," Megan said slowly, "Brooks says Ryan never called you." Sarah's expression flickered just for an instant, but Megan caught at the same instinct that had let her read Ryan's grief months ago, now screaming a very different warning entirely. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Sarah said, carefully taking a small step forward. "Let's just talk about this calmly, Megan. Give me the drive. I'll make sure it gets somewhere safe." "Why would I do that?" Megan said, her grip tightening instinctively on the weapon still in her hand. "When you just admitted you lied about why you're here." Sarah's carefully composed expression finally cracked, and something colder, harder settled behind her eyes. "You don't understand what's at stake, Megan. I have a daughter. Do you understand what General Whitfield's people told me would happen to her college fund, her father's survivor benefits, everything, If I didn't help make sure this particular piece of evidence disappeared quietly, Megan's stomach turned. They threatened you. They didn't threaten, Sarah said bitterly. They offered a very generous settlement, quietly negotiated contingent on my full cooperation in making sure this report never sees daylight, and an implicit understanding of what happens to that settlement if I don't cooperate. Her voice cracked, guilt and desperation warring visibly across her face. I have to protect Emma. You have to understand that. I don't have anyone else. By bearing the truth about her own father's death. Megan's voice rose, disbelief and anger colliding. Sarah, that performance on the radio, was any of it real? Did you mean any of what you told Ryan? Every word, Sarah said, tears welling in her eyes. I meant every word I said to him. I do want the truth for Emma someday. But I also have to feed her. Megan and Whitfield's people made it very clear what happens to a widow's benefits when she becomes inconvenient. Megan stood frozen, the weapon still raised, but her resolve wavering under the weight of Sarah's raw, genuine anguish, a woman caught just as Ryan had been between grief and survival, between doing what was right and doing what her family needed to simply keep living. Give me the drive, Sarah said again, softer, now pleading. Please. I don't want to hurt you. I just need this to be over. I can't, Megan said, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. Sarah, if this disappears, Jason's death stays alive forever. Not just for you, for every family this happens to next, because nobody held Whitfield accountable when they had the chance. Sarah's hand moved toward her jacket pocket, and Megan's entire body tensed, weapon rising instinctively. But instead of a gun, Sarah pulled out a phone, hands trembling as she held it up. They're listening right now, she whispered, tears spilling freely down her face. This whole conversation. I have an open line, Megan. I'm so sorry. I didn't have a choice. The apartment door burst open behind them, and 3 men in tactical gear flooded into the small space. Weapons raised, voices sharp with command. Federal agents, drop your weapon hands where we can see them. Megan's heart lurched, confusion and terror colliding as she lowered the sidearm. Slowly, hands raised, the drive still clutched tight in her fist. Wait, Sarah screamed, stepping between Megan and the advancing agents. Wait, please, she doesn't know anything. This isn't her fault. Ma'am, step back, one of the agents barked. Megan's mind raced, adrenaline and fear making it hard to think clearly, when suddenly a familiar voice cut through the chaos from the doorway. Stand down. All of you, stand down now. Brooks pushed through the agents with a fury Megan had never seen from him, badge held high, voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a man who had just realized how close he'd come to losing everything he'd fought to protect. These men are not federal agents, Brooks said, his eyes locked on the lead agent with cold, dangerous clarity. I ran your credentials the moment dispatch flagged unauthorized personnel converging on this address. There is no federal task force assigned to this case. You work for Whitfield. The lead agent's expression flickered, and in that half-second of hesitation, Brooks's own security team flooded in behind him, weapons raised, and the standoff that followed lasted only seconds before the false agents, badly outnumbered and clearly unprepared for actual resistance, surrendered without further struggle. In the chaos that followed, Megan sank down onto the edge of Ryan's dusty, abandoned couch. The drive still clutched tight against her chest, her whole body trembling with the aftershock of everything that had just happened. Sarah sat beside her, sobbing quietly, repeating apologies that blurred together into an exhausted, guilt-stricken murmur. Brooks crouched in front of Megan, his expression a mixture of relief and barely controlled fury. Are you hurt? No, Megan managed. I'm not hurt, but Brooks, they were listening. Whitfield knew exactly where I was, exactly what I found. He sent people posing as federal agents to intercept it before it ever left this apartment. I know, Brooks said grimly, which means we're not dealing with someone who's merely desperate anymore. We're dealing with someone willing to impersonate federal law enforcement and threaten a grieving widow's family to bury the truth. That's not just a career-ending scandal anymore, Megan. That's a man who has crossed so many lines he can't see his way back, and men like that don't stop until someone forces them to. Megan looked down at the small drive still clutched in her white-knuckled fist, the only surviving untouched piece of evidence left in the entire investigation, and felt the full, staggering weight of exactly how much now depended on getting it into hands Whitfield's reach couldn't touch. Then we make sure it gets somewhere he can't reach, she said, rising unsteadily to her feet exhaustion and resolve warring in equal measure across her face. Tonight, before he finds a way to try again. Brooks nodded, already reaching for his radio, already calculating the next move in a fight that had stopped hours ago, being simply about one grieving sniper, and had become instead a battle over whether the truth itself could survive against a system determined to protect its own. And somewhere across the city, in an office with the lights burning long past midnight, General Marcus Whitfield was receiving word that his last attempt had failed, and that the woman he had underestimated from the very beginning was still standing, still fighting, and still holding the exact proof that would finally end him. By 2 a.m, the drive sat inside a secure briefcase chained to the wrist of a courier Brooks trusted with his own life, boarding a military transport bound directly for General Reyna's office in Washington, bypassing every local channel that might have been compromised. Megan sat in the back of Brooks's vehicle, still wrapped in a wool blanket someone had draped over her shoulders at some point during the chaos, watching the darkened base slide past the window, her body finally beginning to register just how exhausted it truly was. "You should sleep," Brooks said quietly from the driver's seat. "It's over, Megan. The drive is moving. Sarah's cooperating fully now that she's under protective custody instead of Whitfield's leverage. Ryan's stable. You did it." "It doesn't feel over," Megan admitted, staring out at the darkness. "It feels like the part right before something else happens." "You've earned the right to be wrong about that just this once," Brooks said, and there was a tired warmth in his voice that hadn't been there that morning, back when he was still a stranger walking into her workshop with a folder full of impossible numbers. "Maybe," Megan said, "but humor me anyway. Where's the courier headed exactly? Who else knows the route?" "Only myself and General Reyna," Brooks said. "No one else. Not even my own team knows the flight number." Megan nodded, but the knot in her stomach refused to loosen, and she found herself watching every set of headlights that passed them on the dark highway, cataloging each one, unable to fully release the vigilance that had kept her alive through the last 18 hours. She was right not to. Her phone buzzed at 4 a.m, jolting her from a thin, restless doze in the chair beside Ryan's hospital bed where she'd insisted on staying, despite Brooks's repeated offers of a hotel room. "Ms. Walker," an unfamiliar voice clipped and formal. "This is Colonel Diane Ashford, General Reyna's Chief of Staff. I need you to know something before it reaches the news." Megan sat up, fully hard-hammering. "What happened? Is the courier safe? Did something happen to the drive?" "The drive is safe," Ashford said quickly, and Megan's shoulders sagged with relief so sudden it left her dizzy. "It landed 40 minutes ago under full military escort. I'm calling because General Reyna wanted you to hear this from someone directly involved, not from a news broadcast." "I'm listening." "General Whitfield was taken into custody 30 minutes ago," Ashford continued. "The forensic review confirmed everything in the report. Timestamps, metadata corroborating communications pulled from archive servers Whitfield's people didn't know still existed. It's airtight, Ms. Walker. There is no version of this where he walks away." Relief crashed over Megan so suddenly her hands began to shake around the phone, and for a moment she couldn't speak at all, simply sitting there in the dim hospital room, letting 18 hours of terror finally begin to drain out of her body. "He tried to resign his commission the moment federal investigators arrived at his residence," Ashford went on. "General Reyna refused to accept it. She wants him facing court-martial, not a quiet retirement with his pension intact. There's already talk of additional charges, obstruction, conspiracy, accessory to attempted murder in connection with the incident on Copper Ridge, and a separate investigation opening into Master Sergeant Voss's chain of command to determine who else authorized that operation." "How high does it go?" Megan asked. "Whitfield couldn't have done all of this completely alone. The fake federal agents, the intercepted transport, Voss's deployment that takes resources. Authorization, people who look the other way." There was a brief pause on the line, and when Ashford spoke again, her voice had lowered slightly, as though she were choosing her words with extra care. "That's precisely what General Reyna intends to find out. This isn't going to be a quick, clean resolution, Ms. Walker. It's going to take months, possibly years, to trace every thread. But it's going to happen, and it's happening because of what you and Sergeant Mitchell risked today." "There's one more thing," Ashford said, her voice softening slightly. "General Reyna asked me to tell you personally Sergeant Mitchell's cooperation, and yours is being taken into serious consideration regarding his own charges. This isn't going to erase what he did to Colonel Reyes. That's still a death, Ms. Walker, and the Army takes that seriously regardless of the circumstances, but context matters. What you both did today matters. After the call ended, Megan sat in the quiet hospital room for a long moment, watching Ryan's chest rise and fall in steady, peaceful rhythm, before she finally allowed herself to cry. Not from fear this time, but from something closer to relief, closer to the exhausted release of a weight she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying since the moment Major Brooks first walked into her workshop. Ryan's eyes opened slowly sometime after dawn, finding her still seated beside him, her face pale with exhaustion but calm in a way it hadn't been in days. "You look terrible," he rasped, a weak smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You look worse," Megan shot back, and something like a laugh, small and cracked and real, escaped both of them at once. "Tell me," Ryan said, his voice steadying as memory returned. "Tell me it worked." Megan reached for his hand, holding it gently, mindful of the IV line taped there. "Whitfield's in custody." The report held up. "Every word of it, Ryan. Raina's already talking about a wider investigation into how many other reports he might have buried over the years." Ryan's eyes filled with tears. He made no effort to hide his exhausted body sagging back against the pillow, with something that looked for the first time in 11 months like actual relief instead of grief, fueled resolve. "Jason," he whispered, "it actually mattered. What he went through, it's finally going to matter." "It always mattered," Megan said gently. "It just took too long for the truth to catch up." Ryan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a weight Megan hadn't heard from him before. Not fury, not grief, but something closer to a hard, clear-eyed reckoning. "I still killed a man, Megan," he said quietly. "I know what's coming for me. Court-martial. Prison probably for a long time. I made peace with that up on that ridge before you climbed up there and gave me a reason to want to survive it instead of just accept it." "You'll face consequences," Megan agreed, refusing to soften a truth he clearly needed spoken plainly. "But you'll face them as the man who exposed a cover-up that would have kept getting soldiers killed instead of the man who died alone on a mountain with nobody left to hear why. That's not nothing, Ryan. That might be the only kind of redemption you get to have, but it's real and it's yours." He nodded slowly, tears slipping silently down his face, and squeezed her hand with what little strength he had left. "Will you stay just for a while longer?" "I'm not going anywhere," Megan said, and meant it more completely than she'd meant almost anything in the 10 quiet years before that morning Brooks had walked into her workshop. The days that followed unfolded in a strange, disorienting blur. Reporters began calling the base within 48 hours, somehow already possessing fragments of the story: a sniper, an impossible shot, a cover-up, a woman from a weapons workshop who had walked unarmed into an active standoff. Megan's phone, which had rarely rung more than once a week for the past decade, suddenly wouldn't stop buzzing with numbers she didn't recognize. Journalists offering interviews, producers offering appearances, none of which she had any interest in accepting. "You could tell your side," Brooks suggested one afternoon, finding her in the base cafeteria staring at yet another missed call notification, "before someone else tells it for you badly with half the facts wrong." "I don't need the world to know my name, Brooks," Megan said. "I needed the Army to know the truth about Jason Miller. That's done. Everything else is just noise." "You might not have a choice about the noise," Brooks warned. "Whitfield's court-martial is going to be public. You'll be called to testify. There's no version of this where you get to stay entirely invisible." He was right, of course, though Megan spent the following weeks trying in her own quiet way to preserve as much of her ordinary life as she could. She returned to her workshop within days, insisting on it, against the objections of a base commander who worried not unreasonably about her safety given everything that had happened. She calibrated scopes. She rebuilt damaged firing pins. She let the familiar, meditative rhythm of precision work settle her nerves in a way that no amount of official reassurance ever could. But the workshop had changed whether she wanted it to or not. Soldiers who had walked past her door for 10 years without a second glance now stopped sometimes just to nod, sometimes to say her name with a kind of quiet respect that made her deeply uncomfortable. Sometimes simply to say thank you without elaboration, as though the words themselves carried enough weight without needing explanation. Sarah Miller received a formal public apology from the Department of the Army within the month, along with a full restoration of survivor benefits and a settlement large enough to secure Emma's future without anyone dangling it over her head as leverage ever again. Megan visited her once near the end of that first month, finding her sitting on her porch with Emma running through the yard, laughing at nothing in particular, blissfully unaware of just how close her small, ordinary world had come to being permanently altered by forces far beyond her understanding. She asked about her dad the other day. Sarah told Megan watching her daughter chase a butterfly across the grass. Really asked for the first time, wanted to know if he was brave. What did you tell her? I told her the truth, Sarah said, and there was something steadier in her voice now, something that hadn't been there on the night Megan had found her standing in Ryan's darkened apartment, torn between grief and desperate survival. I told her he was the bravest man I ever knew, and that someday when she's older, I'm going to make sure she reads exactly why. How are you doing? Megan asked gently. Really? Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching Emma spin in circles in the afternoon sun. I keep thinking about what I almost did, she admitted, how close I came to helping bury it. I tell myself I didn't have a choice, and some days I believe that. Other days I think about what kind of mother I'd have been if I'd actually gone through with it, and I don't like the answer. You didn't go through with it, Megan said firmly. That's what matters. You told me the truth the second it counted, even scared, even cornered. That's not weakness, Sarah. That's exactly the kind of courage Emma's going to need to hear about someday, too. Sarah managed a small, grateful smile, and the two women sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching a little girl who would never fully understand, not for many years, exactly how much had been risked to make sure her father's memory would someday be told honestly. Ryan's court-martial took place 8 weeks later in a courtroom packed with journalists and soldiers, and in the front row, a woman nobody in that room would have recognized. 6 months earlier, a rifle technician from a windowless workshop in the Montana mountains, sitting quietly beside Major Ethan Brooks, watching a broken man finally receive judgment for the worst decision he'd ever made. The prosecution painted Ryan as a trained killer who had used his skills to commit premeditated murder, methodical and calculated, a man who had planned Colonel Reyes's death for months. The defense countered with testimony from military psychologists about the documented devastating effects of unresolved combat trauma, compounded by institutional betrayal, compounded further by a system that had systematically dismissed every legitimate complaint Ryan had ever filed through proper channels. Megan testified on the third day, her hands steady on the witness stand, despite the weight of dozens of eyes watching her, describing in careful, measured detail the 8 months of conversations that had preceded Copper Ridge. The questions she now understood as quiet cries for help she hadn't recognized in time, and the desperate, broken man she had found on that frozen ridge who had chosen in the end to surrender rather than continue down a path of vengeance. Did Sergeant Mitchell ever express remorse to you? The defense attorney asked. Immediately, Megan answered. The moment I reached him, he didn't defend what he'd done. He never once tried to justify it as something other than what it was. He simply told me he didn't know how to carry what had happened to his friend, and that the system meant to help him carry, it had failed him at every single turn. The prosecution's cross-examination was sharp-pointed, determined to paint her testimony as sympathetic bias from a woman who had, after all, built the very weapon used in the killing. Isn't it true, Ms. Walker, that you feel a certain responsibility for what happened, given that you personally modified the rifle used in Colonel Reyes's death? I feel responsibility for exactly what I'm responsible for, Megan replied evenly, refusing to be rattled. I built a precision instrument for a soldier who told me at the time it was for training purposes. I had no reason to doubt him. What I did after learning the truth, walking into an active standoff, listening to a grieving man, instead of writing him off as simply dangerous, that's the part I'll stand behind completely, because it's the part that ended with a truth finally coming to light instead of 2 more bodies on that mountain. The courtroom was silent after that, and even the prosecutor, Megan noticed, seemed to have no immediate follow-up. The sentence, when it came 3 days later, reflected everything Megan had hoped for and feared in equal measure. 15 years reduced significantly from what prosecutors had originally sought, in recognition of Ryan's cooperation, the documented psychological toll of his combat trauma, and the undeniable public service performed by exposing Whitfield's cover-up. Not freedom, not forgiveness, not entirely, but not the ending that had seemed so inevitable on that frozen ridge either. 15 years, Ryan said quietly after the courtroom had emptied, when Megan was finally allowed a few minutes alone with him before transport. I keep trying to feel angry about that number. I can't. It feels like mercy. It is mercy, Megan said gently. You'll be out before you're 50, Ryan. You'll have a life left to live. Use it. I don't know how to be anything other than a weapon, he admitted, and there was real fear in the confession, real uncertainty in a man who had spent his entire adult life defined by precision and violence in a country's need for both. Then learn, Megan said simply. You have 15 years, and I intend to visit you regularly enough to make sure you actually do. Something in Ryan's exhausted, grief-worn face shifted at that, the first real flicker of something that looked almost like hope, almost like the possibility of a future he'd never let himself imagine during those 11 brutal months on the mountain. Why, he asked quietly, why do this for me? You could walk away right now. Nobody would blame you. Megan considered the question seriously the way she considered every question that actually mattered. Because for 10 years I told myself my only job was the medal in my hands, not the man carrying it, she said finally. You're the reason I stopped believing that. I'm not going to forget the lesson just because the hard part's over. Megan kept that promise. Every few months she made the long drive to the federal facility where Ryan was serving his sentence, bringing news of Sarah and Emma, updates on the ongoing investigation into how many other cover-ups Whitfield's decade of command had produced, and slowly, gradually watching the hollow, haunted look in Ryan's eyes give way to something calmer, something closer to peace. The investigation into Whitfield's broader network, exactly as Ashford had warned, took considerably longer than anyone anticipated. It would be nearly 2 years before the full scope became clear. 3 other after-action reports quietly altered under Whitfield's command over the preceding decade, 2 additional officers implicated in the cover-up, in a disturbing pattern of promotions handed out specifically to soldiers willing to look the other way when convenient. Congress opened a formal inquiry. Whitfield's court-martial, when it finally concluded, resulted in a sentence considerably harsher than Ryan's own, the full weight of a system finally belatedly holding accountable the very people it had spent years quietly protecting. Major Brooks retired from active duty 18 months after Copper Ridge, choosing instead to lead a newly established oversight division specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of institutional cover-up that had cost Jason Miller his life and nearly cost Ryan Mitchell his own. He asked Megan more than once whether she'd consider joining him full-time. Her expertise, he argued her instinct for reading the truth beneath a system's carefully constructed lies, was too valuable to leave behind in a windowless workshop. She always declined gently and always for the same reason. I'm not meant to be the one standing in front of the cameras, she told him, sitting once again at her familiar workbench, hands steady around a rifle bolt, the particular silence of her workshop settling comfortably around her like an old, well-worn coat. I'm meant to be the one who makes sure the people doing the standing have something they can actually trust in their hands when it matters. But something had changed undeniably in the quiet rhythm of her days. Soldiers who once walked past her workshop without a second glance now stopped to say her name, to shake her hand, to tell her awkwardly and sincerely that they'd heard what she'd done. She still didn't seek it out. She still preferred the quiet hum of careful, precise work to any spotlight. But she no longer felt invisible, and some deep, long-buried part of her understood that this being seen, being known, even in small, unassuming ways, had been worth more than she'd ever let herself admit. 2 years after Copper Ridge, Megan received a letter from Ryan, the handwriting steadier than she remembered it being on that frozen mountain, the words carrying a calm she hadn't heard in his voice since long before Jason Miller's death. He wrote about a job program he'd joined inside the facility, teaching basic mechanical skills to other inmates. Nothing like the precision weapons work he'd once been famous for, but something, he said, that finally felt like building instead of destroying. He wrote about Emma, who'd started sending him drawings through Sarah, colorful, uneven pictures of mountains and rifles, and in one memorable image, a woman with wild gray streaked hair that Ryan had immediately recognized as an unmistakably accurate, if generously flattering, portrait of Megan herself. He wrote near the end of the letter about the last thing he remembered thinking before he lowered that rifle on Copper Ridge, not fear, not grief, but a strange, sudden clarity that the hardest shot of his entire career hadn't been the one that killed Colonel Reyes from 3,800 meters away. It had been the one he chose not to take. Megan folded the letter carefully and set it on her workbench beside the rifle she was calibrating for a young private who'd walked into her workshop that morning with nervous hands and a weapon that needed careful, patient attention. The private had asked her shyly whether the stories were true, whether she was really the woman from the mountain, the one from the news. I'm just the woman who fixes rifles, Megan told him, and meant it mostly. Everything else was just doing what needed to be done. She thought, as she often did now, about the 10 quiet years she'd spent believing her only purpose was the medal in her hands, and about the single terrifying transformative day that had taught her the truth was always bigger than that. A weapon was only as trustworthy as the person who built it. She had always believed, and she still believed, that now more firmly than ever. But she understood something else now too, something the mountain had carved into her, with its cold wind and its impossible distances, and its broken, grieving soldier who had chosen in the end to trust her instead of his own devastating fury. The most powerful thing anyone could build wasn't a rifle capable of striking a target nearly 4 kilometers away. It was the courage to put that weapon down and the compassion of someone willing to stand close enough to remind you why. Years later, soldiers on that base still talked about the legendary shot fired from Copper Ridge, still marveled at a distance that had rewritten what anyone believed a rifle could achieve. But Megan Walker knew with a certainty that had settled deep into her bones that the real story was never about the bullet at all. It was about a woman nobody noticed who chose to notice someone else, and in doing so saved not just one broken soldier's life, but the truth itself in every family who would never again have to wonder what really happened to the ones they loved and lost. That is the story of Megan Walker, the woman they saw cleaning rifles, who became the woman who stopped a war between vengeance and justice, and whose quiet courage proved once and for all that the hardest victory anyone can win is not defeating an enemy. It is saving another human being from becoming one.